Hello. Welcome to Muriel's Murders. I'm Muriel, and I love true crime.
I'm Nick, and I am not a fan.
Thank you for joining us. Each week, I force Nick to listen to me tell him a story of a true crime. This week's episode is inspired by a good friend and listener who lives in Missouri. You know who you are. So, this week, we're bringing you part one of a two-part in-depth look at the life and death of Ken McElroy.
Who is Ken McElroy?
All right. Ken McElroy is an attempted murderer, rapist, and leader of a multi-state theft ring who terrorized a small town in Missouri for over 2 decades before being murdered in 1981 by a bunch of farmers in broad daylight.
Okay, so this is going to be some heavy shit this episode.
I think that this might be the most violent episode that we've done so far.
Okay.
It was one of those things where I was really excited about the story, and then as I read, I got this really great book, and reading it just got more and more drastic.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we're in it now. I just read like a 400-page book, so I'm not going to not talk about it.
All right, great, fair enough. Well, before we get to Muriel's gruesomeness, it is my favorite part of the podcast, which is where we celebrate our newest Patreon members. We've got Kelsey, Courtney ST, Courtney K, Marissa, and Nina. The ladies are coming out in full force. Thank you so much. Also, some of our listeners have been going out of their way to send us love on social media, and we're going to give a bunch of you guys shout outs at the end of the episode during our outro.
So stay tuned if you want to hear us love on you.
Okay, but before we get to love, I guess we have to get to the real point of this podcast, which is murder.
Okay, this is a true story involving murder, violence, drugs, adult themes, etc. And just for our super sensitive listeners out there, this episode also involves violence against children. So if any listeners are like Nick and they don't want to hear about things like that, please consider listening to a different podcast.
And we'll probably make some jokes, and we'll probably use some swear words. So if those things are upsetting, also please consider yourself warned.
All right, Nikki, are you ready to hear this story?
No!
Okay, let's get started.
Well, there's no postponing the inevitable, so let's just get on with this horrific story.
Come on, man. You're going to love this story.
Okay.
It's so epic. It's insane. The more I read, I was like, oh my God.
All right, once upon a time, let's do it.
Okay, we're doing it. So the murder that is the centerpiece of this story happens in Skidmore, Missouri. So this is a super tiny farm town in northwestern Missouri. And in 1981, when Ken McElroy was murdered, the population was around 437.
Oh, damn.
Including Ken McElroy.
So 436 by the end of that day.
Good math, Nikki.
Okay, thanks.
So today, the population is around 189. So the town, like a lot of towns in the region, are kind of shrinking.
Sure.
The story takes place mainly in Skidmore, Missouri, but broadly, it happens in Nottoway County and the adjacent towns around Skidmore because they're all very close together. They're all very tiny. And a lot of these smaller towns share a lot of the same resources. So like a place like Skidmore with 437 people doesn't have like a dedicated police force.
Right.
Right. So
Sure.
A lot of the things that are happening in this story are going to involve all kinds of different tiny towns. For the most part, I tried to be like specific as to where it's happening.
Yeah.
But broadly, just think of it as like this area.
Got it.
That
Yeah.
all pooled resources, very similar culture.
That makes sense, yeah.
So in 1981, downtown Skidmore had 2 paved streets and no stoplights. So teeny tiny, like when they say it's like one stoplight town.
Yeah, I think you got it.
Not even that, right?
Oh, yeah.
So there was an American Legion Hall, a gas station, a bank, the D&D grocery, and the D&G Tavern were kind of the main buildings on Main Street.
Yeah, you can get some food and you can get a drink after you go grocery shopping.
Yeah, and the D&G Tavern at the time, it's this really great building. It's like corrugated iron outside that's like painted white.
Yeah.
And it has 2 windows cut into it. It's just like Miller time or whatever.
Oh, awesome. Yeah.
But it's very like, looks like a murder shack. Like you wouldn't go in there. Right. But I was like, oh my God, I have to go in there.
I know. Yeah. Ooh, dive bars.
Yeah. So like I said, they don't have a dedicated police force. Occasionally there's a marshal, like a town marshal who's in charge of, keeping the peace and making sure people aren't doing crazy things and stray dogs aren't everywhere or whatever.
Okay, right.
But the way to be a marshal, I believe you have to be elected, but there's no like training, or if there is, I think it's an hour or something like that. Like it's not, you don't have to be in law enforcement on any level to be a town marshal in this situation.
All right, cool.
So in this tiny town of Skidmore, the community is super homogenous, right? You have farmers who've worked the land for years and have passed that down in generations.
Yeah.
Everybody knows each other, right? I think it was 98% white,
Okay.
but then those percentages were like some people are a quarter Cherokee.
You mean the 2% left
right,
over?
exactly. So
yeah.
it adds up to 2 full percentages.
Yeah.
It's a very homogenous town. I think one of my favorite details was that country music is the only music in 1981 that came on the radio waves.
Well, that's the only music there is, Muriel. You want to hear noise? Well, I could show you noise, but if you want to hear music, you got to go to 102.1 Power Country.
Okay, great. Okay. So basically we're talking about this sort of Norman Rockwell classic small town America.
Yeah.
Right. Nobody locks their doors. Everybody knows each other. A big part of this community that people talk about often is where everyone is and what everyone's doing all the time based on their cars.
Oh.
So who went to the bank, who's been at the bar all day. Everybody knows everything. So there's kind of no secrets.
All right.
They all function as a giant family in a way, and even if they don't talk about the gossip, which they probably do, they all just see everything all the time.
Classic small town business.
Right. The only ways like that people really differentiated from each other in a way, from what I've read, is this sort of caste system of farming. So instead of it being like upper class or lower class or business class or white collar and blue collar, it was more separated by the types of farmer you were. So the top echelon of farmer is someone who has a lot of land, who is very successful in their farming. And then the second tier is someone who has a moderate amount of land and is more of those, I don't know if it's called subsistence farming, but essentially that a bad season could potentially break the farm.
Sure.
So you don't have a lot of money saved up, but you're working and you're doing okay. And maybe you have a ton of kids, right? And then the second level after that is sharecroppers. So you kind of rent out a piece of land from a larger farmer and you farm that land and then give them a percentage of whatever you farm. And then the last would be tenant farmers. And those are people who go from gig to gig, right? And you pick apples for a season, or, you help out, at different parts of the farming cycle.
So basically it's a bunch of farmers.
Yeah, right. There's also a fair contingency of people who don't work and cause a lot of trouble.
Oh, you mean the cool people? The party animals?
The party animals, let's call them that. So McElroy's people came from the cool kid contingency, kind of troublemaking contingency, bootleggers, and the tenant farmer contingency.
All right.
We're going to start with Ken's mother's life, because I think that the whole tenant farming culture is super interesting, and I just want to tell you about it. And I think it gives a lot of insight into the way in which Ken grew up.
Yeah.
That
okay,
sounds
great. Yeah.
So his mother, Mabel Lister, was born not too far away in Dover, Kansas in 1897. So
that seems like a billion trillion years ago. Okay.
It's a long time ago. Yeah. So she was one of 5 children, and her family were tenant farmers. So basically they get hired for a season or a month or whatever, like we were talking about.
Yeah.
And they moved from ranch to ranch, and they stayed in these shacks. So on each ranch, they would have places to live for the tenant farmers. They didn't have indoor plumbing or electricity or anything like that.
Hard living.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You have such a funny way of talking.
What's funny about me?
Hard living. I was like, I've never heard you say that before in my life.
I don't know. I'm just getting. I don't know. I feel like
I feel
it's
like
like
you're getting into the vibe of
yeah,
the story.
it's like cowboy life or something. I don't know. Yeah.
So no running water, no electricity. And when Mabel was 14, she married 20-year-old Tony McElroy.
Mm-hmm.
Tony McElroy was handsome and tall and pretty bad-tempered. Mm-hmm. He made moonshine. He drank moonshine. He'd get drunk, and was kind of a wild child.
Okay.
So that's
Papa
McElroy's
and
thing.
Mama.
Papa
Got
and
it.
Mama, tenant
Yeah.
farmer, and then Wildman Jones.
Yeah.
He owned horses and a wagon, and so he made his money hauling for people. So he did things that weren't exactly tenant farming.
Now I just feel like everything I was saying. I'd be like, "Oh, he was a hauler, was he?" I was like doing something terrible. Okay.
No, you're not terrible.
No, I'm just kidding, and I'm just I'm creating my own character within this world.
Okay, well, listen to the story and then react to it.
Okay, good.
So in 1911, right before her 15th birthday, Mabel had the first of 16 children.
Damn.
So she had 16 kids over the next 28 years.
That's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it is. It's more than a kid every other year.
Damn.
Yeah. So around 1927, Tony and Mabel McElroy made this big decision. They took all their money and they packed up the family and they moved to the Ozarks in southern Missouri to rent out a 400-acre farm and plant corn. And it went really well. This was kind of a big dream for Mabel, because her family were all tenant farmers, and it's this great thing for Tony to be working off the land and have so much acreage. And they planted the whole thing out. It went really well. And then they just had this streak of really bad dry weather.
Oh, no.
And all the corn died.
Ugh.
So they lost everything. They packed it up. They left the Ozarks. They came back to a small town kind of just outside of Skidmore.
Uh-huh.
And the family worked as tenant farmers, just like Mabel's parents did. And they were living in the same small shacks, just earning enough money to survive.
Yeah.
So that's where Ken McElroy was born.
Yeah. What child was he in this the span of 16 kids?
Second to last.
God, there's almost no answer to that wouldn't be interesting.
I know.
The first or like dead middle or fourth or fifth. Like there's no uninteresting answer, but there's something about second to last.
Not the baby.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about his birth order, it was after this kind of devastating loss that essentially broke his dad, and he kind of came in at the end of that. Mm-hmm. So he spent most of his childhood tenant farming with his dad. And in the 1940s, the McElroy family actually managed to save enough money to purchase a 2-bedroom farmhouse on 175 acres. So big come up.
Yeah.
The house is always full of people. Married children of the McElroys moved in with their spouses. At one point, there was 18 people living in this 2-bedroom house.
That's either the most fun thing in the world or just the worst nightmare.
I think from what I've read and seen, it was a nightmare. Mm-hmm. So Mabel is the only person who does anything. So Mabel was in charge of essentially hand washing everyone's clothes and cooking every dinner from scratch.
Fuck that. Pardon my French. That's ridiculous. You're going to have 16 kids and they're not going to pitch in and fry up some pork?
They were doing stuff like on the farm.
Yeah.
They were out there working.
Yeah.
And she was supposed to keep the house. But I think the idea was that the wash would always be piled up. The dishes would be piled up. And that's the environment that Ken McElroy grew up in.
Yeah.
It's either working at the farm or coming home and, living in this pretty chaotic environment.
Yeah. You think out of 16 kids, one of them would be like, all right, you're my assistant. I'm taking.
There was one, his youngest brother, Tim, who was kind of the favorite, and the baby did stay home and help her often.
Yeah.
But I don't know how you would even keep up. There's no way to keep up with doing that unless everybody washed their own clothes and cooked their own food.
God, child number 16 was their favorite. You think maybe on some of that would be their least favorite.
Yeah.
It's like, you're my last. I got nothing left.
No, he's a little baby. They loved him.
All right.
So the house is always super gross. And I guess we'll just move over to Ken. So that's the environment he grew up in.
Yeah.
And I think Ken was, generally speaking, a brooder. You know, his dad was pretty abusive and his dad was just not fond of him. And eventually, after trying to discipline him and making him do certain things and Ken not listening, he just sort of said, well, I'm just going to let this one go. So he's pretty wild at a young age. He was super handsome. He had dark hair and blue eyes, just like you, Nikki.
My
Very
eyes are
cute.
turquoise and everyone knows it.
So Ken's siblings pretty much avoided him. His dad kind of avoided him or wrote him off, and his classmates kind of did too. So by the time he hit puberty, he had this reputation as someone not to mess with.
Yeah.
And by the time he dropped out of 8th grade at the age of 15, he couldn't read or write.
Oh, wow.
Other kids who grew up on farms, you know, they would go home after school and help their family and work on the farm. And Ken, at that point, just decided he was over it. He used to just jump on his horse and ride around, ride into other people's property, shoot raccoons. He would go hunting. So he basically was just on his own.
Yeah.
He didn't do anything that anyone told him to do. He had like a reputation for being this menace, but he actually didn't have a lot of fist fights and things like that. It was more like he pulled a knife on a kid. He's an intimidating person.
Oh, I get it.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, because when you were like, oh, people knew not to mess with him, I was like, ooh, is he like good at fighting? But really, he's just like pulling out weapons, and other people are like, whoa, what the hell is this about?
It's a lot of that, or a lot of, I think that one of the stories was he's riding around, and you're supposed to get permission when you ride through other people's property, like your neighbors' farms and stuff like that. And he's the kind of person who, if a farmer was like, I didn't give you permission to be here, he would say, I don't care.
Yeah.
And then the farmer would sort of just walk away. You know what I mean? People didn't want the conflict.
Right.
And so I think he learned at an early age that he could push that a little bit. His dad was also a super crazy ass. He once stole something from a store, and the shopkeeper called his dad and said, hey, you know, your kid stole something from my store. And the dad came in with a hunting knife and was like, don't you say anything about my children.
Sure.
You know, so it's a little like father, like son.
Okay, great. And this is not some charming wilderness kid who, you know, just kind of frolicking through the countryside because he's got a free spirit. He's
he's like
for
a
trouble.
violent seeming untouchable weirdo. That's where he's at.
All right.
He dropped out of school and he didn't work on the farm. You know, the family's relatively broke. He didn't
contribute or help.
Right, but he also didn't have any money. So that's when he started stealing. So he used to do stuff like siphon gas from trucks and tractors, and kind of he took his truck and go to a train car and steal a bunch of grain and drive it, try to sell the grain. Just small town.
Wow, that's a pretty big crime.
Yeah, well, it gets pretty crazy what he's actually capable of.
Okay.
And he would do just stuff like his car needed a new transmission, so he would go up to a farm at night and just straight up steal someone's transmission out of their car and put it into his car and drive away.
Yeah, it's bold.
It's bold. Like he's bold. And that's like what we'll be talking about a lot of his life and what he did.
Yeah.
To get to the point where he was so legendary that he was essentially untouchable by police in modern days.
Okay, I am really into this.
So in 1952, when he was 18, he married a 16-year-old girl named Aletta. And he moved away. He took a job working construction, and a cribbing form, which I think is kind of like scaffolding on the construction site, fell from 30 feet above and hit him in the head and cracked his helmet, and he had to get stitches. And then ever since then, he had nerve pain and blackouts for the rest of his life. Oh. And now I think that the idea is that he probably had a pretty significant traumatic brain injury.
Yeah.
But that was the last time he ever worked a quote unquote job.
Okay.
So
yeah.
What?
He was already pretty crazy, and then this possibly like totally knocked his screws loose.
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea was he was stealing and everything, and then he got married and tried to work, and then had a pretty horrible injury, and then just never worked again.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I can relate, I guess. It's like you finally get a job, and you're like, "This is how you repay me? You guys didn't even bolt the thing correctly? Forget that. I'm out."
So Aletta and Ken then moved back to Missouri a couple years later. And then he just started stealing again around Nottoway County and just to make ends meet.
Yeah.
And he had this kind of interesting system to steal livestock. So you'll see this as his life progresses, but he really does have these innovative ways of doing things. So he lined the trucks of his car with plywood and he would wear all black, and he got a toggle switch for the lights on his truck so he could turn them on and off and like glide into.
Wait, do you say stealing livestock?
Yeah. So he started stealing cows and pigs, which you can get about $60 an animal, I think, at that time. So it was a pretty, it's fairly lucrative.
I'm also not understanding the toggle switch to glide in and out. What do you mean by that?
Like if he was out on a farm and he had a really easy way to turn his lights on and off to hide from farmers who he was stealing the livestock from. So it was like, so if he's out at the back of the truck and he's loading in pigs and he needs to cut the lights because he thinks someone might see him, he can cut the lights from the back.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
He should have just patented that, sold that.
Damn, Nick.
You know what I mean?
You should have been his dad. That's a straight up dad suggestion right there. So he wasn't making a ton of money, but he's stealing a bunch of stuff, and he's already developing a reputation as sort of a badass rebel dude,
Yeah.
He also tended often to stay away from anyone who had money, like wealthier people and people who had access to legal recourse, and really stayed in this zone of robbing and participating in criminal stuff with poorer people who didn't have a lot of recourse.
Oh, I get it. Right. He was choosing his victims carefully.
Yeah.
Predatory shit.
Yeah, he's a predator. Yeah. And he also came from that, so he knows what that is, and he knows the needs of the people, and I think he had a sense of how far you can push someone, if they don't have a lot of resources at their disposal.
Yeah, he's like just a master manipulator, basically.
Yeah. And at this point, I'm going to say, heads up, this guy is an absolute monster with women. So I'm just letting you know that's going to be the next 45 minutes of what happens with this person.
Okay, great. Because we haven't really done like sexual violence on this podcast yet. And that is like the thing that really disturbs me about other podcasts that you listen to. And so I couldn't tell if you were warning me or our listeners about what's about to happen, but I'm just,
I'm warning everyone. I think this portion of this story is really important to understand like the core of what happened, because the way that people turned a blind eye to domestic abuse and let it exist as an open secret, I think is part of what empowered, this person to become a monster who believed he was above the law. I just want you to keep in mind the culpability of the society that allowed this to happen.
Yeah.
And I think the consequences of being a society that allows these things to happen.
Right.
It's just that idea of like, just because it's happening to your neighbor doesn't mean it won't happen to you. And what are we allowing to exist in our good town with our good people?
Yes. Right.
So Ken bragged a ton about basically being a pedophile. He's like, I love young girls. I like them to be 12 or 13. At this point, he's married. He's still married to Aletta, and he's in his 20s.
Yeah.
And it's an odd time in history because his mother was 14 when she was married, and his wife was 16 when they got married, and all of that was kind of kosher. But the way that he talked about it and the way he joked about it and the way that he treated these girls, it's clear that this is about being a predator. It's not clear. It's not about like some sort of cultural thing that happened in the 1800s. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So at this point in his life, when they're back in this little town outside of Skidmore, he starts regularly sleeping with a 13-year-old girl named Donna. And Donna doesn't feature really heavily in this story, but this is a good example of the type of person he is, where he would go kind of lure Donna out of the house, have sex with her in the woods, bring her back to her house. And it's this open secret. So all the neighbors know he's doing this with this child.
Right.
His family knows, and nobody stops him because he's got this crazy reputation.
Yeah.
And he runs into Donna's grandfather at a bar when he's like hanging out with some of his friends and they're getting drunk.
Yeah.
And he looks at Donna's grandfather and he's like, oh, hey, how's Donna? Just wondering. And he, the grandfather obviously snaps and says, if you don't stay away from my granddaughter, I'm going to call the police. And McElroy is the type of person where if you threaten him, he just goes ballistic because he's an animal.
Yeah.
And he decides he's going to go burn this guy's house down.
Oh, damn.
But this is how wild he is. So he gets all his friends. They go to the grandfather's house. They break in. They sit around in the kitchen. They decide they're hungry. They make a bunch of sandwiches. And then they hear someone walking around upstairs who's still awake. And he goes, I don't feel like burning down the house today. And they leave.
Okay. All right. Who are his friends?
Like a couple teenagers. He always hangs out with younger people, I think really consistently.
Yeah.
And the way that resolved is that Donna ended up getting pregnant and having his kid a year later. And then she just never comes back into the story.
Oh, yeah. Did her family rescue her out of there, or?
I'm assuming they don't really talk about her again, but this is the kind of person he is, the kind of effect he has on this community. He just starts creating pain.
Yeah, right. Just damaging everyone.
Right. So he's still married to Aletta, and at this point he's sleeping with a 15-year-old named Sharon from a nearby town called St. Joseph. And he's in his mid-20s. And he's with Sharon and they're in his truck and they get into this argument. And Ken threatens her with a gun. He says, if you don't stop talking, I'm going to blow your head off. And either he shot it or it went off, depending on who you believe. But he shot off the bottom of her chin. So she's still alive, but she has to have stitches. And she's got obviously injuries.
Yeah.
So Ken runs back to Aletta and he says, I need to divorce you so I can marry Sharon to keep her from testifying against me.
Oh, that classic move.
Right. Very classic. So Aletta agrees and Ken marries Sharon in 1958. So that's his second wife. Ken and Sharon have a boy named Jerome and they move back to this 2-bedroom house with his parents. They move back to the McElroy farm. And
the 2-bedroom house with his parents and 1,000 other people.
Right. And it's chaos. It's not great. And they notice that Sharon and Ken are pretty much neglecting this baby. So one of Ken's sisters takes the baby and moves to California. And they have a daughter in 1961.
Hold on, time out. Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Is that happily ever after for baby Jerome?
I'll say this.
Yeah.
That all of the kids in the documentary that I watched of his say he was a great dad. So keep that in mind, whatever it is.
Okay.
All of his kids are like, he was really great. I mean, they're ignoring what he did to their mothers, which is mind blowing to me.
Yeah.
But the kids were not harmed by him.
Okay. All right. Well,
as far as they say in interviews and pretty extensive interviews.
Okay.
So Sharon has a daughter in 1961. And the same year, Sharon grabs her daughter and she shows up at the Maryville police station. She's terrified. Ken had locked her in the house with the baby for 2 days and he's been beating her terribly to the point where everyone knows.
Yeah.
His whole family knows. Their neighbors know. If she has to go to the store, she's injured. She's beat up really terribly. And she says, if I go back now that I've escaped, Ken will probably kill me. So they send Sharon, who's now 18, and her baby into a foster home together. And at the foster home, Sharon tells her foster mother that Ken had actually recently brought home a 14-year-old named Sally and would force them all to have sex and hit them. And that story comes out. The prosecutor charges Ken with domestic abuse.
That is so tragic and sad that this girl is still a girl. She's so young and so much a girl that the way they protect her is by putting her into a foster care, not for her child, but for her.
And this is one of 2 wives that this had to happen for. This guy is he's just a total monster. Yeah. So the county prosecutor charges Ken with domestic abuse on behalf of Sharon, right? Or because of what happened to Sharon. And Ken, because he has a network of people, and this is something to remember throughout the whole story, he's a really sophisticated thief. And the way that you do that is by having this network of people that help him scout things to steal, help him steal things. And so he finds out immediately where Sharon's foster home is. And he contacts her and he says, if you drop the charges, I'll get our baby Jerome back from California. And so she comes home, she drops the charges. He beats her up super badly, but he does bring the kid back from California. So now Sharon is here with her 2 kids.
Damn it. I was really hoping Jerome was going to escape.
No, there's a lot more happening. So
okay, just get ready. All right.
Just get ready.
Okay.
So in terms of Sally, the new girl, Ken had met Sally when she was 13 and started grooming her immediately. Her mom had died and she was being raised by her single dad. So Ken was always around. And, you know, he was also really violent with her. So everyone knew she was dating Ken. Ken would take her out, right?
Yeah.
And he also beat her up so badly when she had to be hospitalized. And the way she got to the hospital was he beat her up and then dumped her in her parents' yard in front of all of her neighbors and then drove away. And nobody calls the police. They just let this thing happen. Like, she's 13.
Wow.
And she gets hospitalized. And while Sally's in the hospital, Ken finds her hospital room and he goes to her and he says, if you don't move in with me, I'm going to beat your dad up like I beat you up. So that's how she ended up moving in with Sharon and Ken.
God damn. It kind of reminds me of R. Kelly a little bit with this whole like young, vulnerable girls in like group sex situations.
I mean, the R. Kelly thing was like, we've said this, I think, on our other podcast, but, you know, we were always fans of that music and it was just this kind of fun, silly thing to listen to. And after watching that documentary, I had no idea how bad it was. So big recommendation if you want to watch, what is it called?
It's called Surviving R. Kelly. Yeah.
Yeah. It's pretty incredible how much people knew for so long.
Yeah.
It's just like the Cosby thing. You know, it's just like, are you kidding me? Everybody knew.
Woody Allen too. Okay, back to Ken.
So Ken is publicly violent with the girls. It's a huge open secret in the community. Everyone knows he has 2 girls living with him at the house. And between 1961 and 1965, the girls had 6 of Ken's children between the 2 of them.
He almost sounds like a cult leader of sorts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what he provides is money and security, and his theft ring was really thriving throughout most of this. It's just growing and growing. So he is the guy who has really cool cars, like muscle cars and trucks. He's got brand new guns. He was really into his appearance. Like, even as he got older, he gained a bunch of weight and stuff, but he would always dye his hair jet black and slick it back. And he was always wearing nice clothes and stuff like that.
But he still lived in this house with all these people?
Yeah. I mean, I think when he left the house, he was looking pretty good in his clothes and hair and everything like that. But I think that a lot of these girls, you know, when you're looking at where they're coming from, I mean, they're coming from poverty and they're coming from situations where they don't have anybody aggressively looking out for them, you know, and they're coming from a culture where people were getting married at 15, you know, so girls are dating. Some of the stuff they were talking about, oh, she went on a date and it's like she's 12. I mean, I went on a date when I was 12, but I feel like they have like proms and homecoming queens for pretty young women. You know,
you're
girls.
not going out on a date with a crime syndicate boss in a Mustang at 12.
They just aren't saying any, you know, the community basically just let it happen.
Yeah.
So then after having his 3rd child with Sally's dad died and Ken just ditched her. So she tried to raise her 3 kids in a little 1-bedroom apartment, but it just didn't work. She had a bad babysitter who ended up throwing this huge party and the cops came and they took away the kids and Sally didn't have any money. She couldn't get the kids back. So the kids ended up going to the foster mother who actually had taken care of Sharon and her kids. So
it's just like a savior lady of this area trying to help out.
Yeah, the foster parents are basically just dealing with Ken McElroy's violence and his kids, you know. So she took in Sally's kids. Those kids got adopted out and they made it out. So they were in another. Nobody knew they were McElroy's super cute little blonde kids. They made it out. And then Sally disappears. Around the time that Ken kicks Sally and the kids out of the house with Sharon, Ken actually left Sharon at the farmhouse to go move in with a girl named Alice Wood, who he's been seeing since 1961 when Alice was 15.
Whatever happened to Aletta? She's gone.
She got divorced. She left.
Left.
He divorced her to marry Sharon.
And she's no longer in the picture at all.
Yeah, she's gone.
Okay.
No longer in the picture. Alice does stay with us. So now we're getting into women who are, or girls that are going to be with him towards the end.
Okay.
So Alice does stay with us. As he was with his other wives, Ken is incredibly violent with Alice. And from what I've read, it seems like he was maybe the most violent with Alice. Really unpredictable, locked her in the apartment all the time. Alice had actually ran away from home at the age of 13 and never knew her father. And she had a stepfather that they didn't get along. So she definitely had a rough life.
Yeah.
So by now it's the mid 60s. All right. And police in St. Joseph and in Nottoway County know that Ken is just stealing hella stuff.
Like what? Are we going to get into that?
Well, he's got a crime ring. He steals hogs. He steals cattle. He has a massive grain stealing operation. And then he also breaks into different warehouses and steals these super expensive farm chemicals, sometimes at like $20,000 a pop.
Wow.
Like crazy amounts. And back then, that's a lot of money.
Yeah, hell yeah.
And it's on this huge, large scale because not only is it in Missouri, he's also stealing things in Kansas and Nebraska.
Yeah.
And because animals in Missouri weren't branded, like they weren't required to be branded, and some stores didn't really keep good records, cops just could not get enough evidence together to charge him. Because if somebody has 50 pigs and they say, well, Ken McElroy stole 6 of my pigs, they're like, cool, what do they look like? He's like, I don't know, they're like pigs. If they're not branded, they have to say like, oh, that's the one that has the torn ear, and I'm missing one that's bright pink with little brown spots. Like they all look identical, right?
Totally.
So they can't like really get this evidence together to charge him.
Where's Ace Ventura, pet detective, when you need him?
And people would file criminal complaints against him, but then they would just withdraw them really quickly. So police would kind of get people that would say they'd testify, and they'd be intimidated out of testifying.
Sure.
So police weren't really eager to keep prosecuting these crimes because the people who were reporting these crimes wouldn't stand up in court.
Yeah, they'd back out at the last second. The cops would be like, all right, I guess we're done. I know, it's kind of crazy that some farmer along the way didn't catch him and kill him in the act.
That's what everybody says.
Really?
There's so many quotes of people being like, why didn't we just shoot him when he was taking a leak off his porch? You know, but they didn't, you know.
A leak off his porch, but also stealing my stuff.
Right. Right. That's probably more accurate. You know, and he was known as being the super violent offender too. Like he stole 2 horses from this farmer and then beat him with the butt of a rifle, you know, really. Just
like armed robbery.
Yeah, essentially. Yeah. And Ken's cover was that the McElroy farm was this functional farm and hog raising outfits. But okay, listen. He's surrounded by farmers. Farmers know what a functional farm looks like. And everybody was like, it's obviously not a functional farm. It's literally uncleared fields and a bunch of obviously stolen pigs that are just wandering around this like junkyard. You know, like
right. That's the one with the torn ear. And there's a bright pink one with the little brown spots that he stole from Larry the other day.
Right. I mean, people are just, they're like, that's the breed of hog of the guy who just lost 15 hogs.
Yeah.
It's just very, very clear to everyone that he's obviously the one stealing all this stuff.
Yeah.
So moving on, in 1968, Alice, who he's living with in an apartment in St. Joseph, gives birth to their first son. His name is Juarez. And around this time, Sharon has enough, and she finally leaves the McElroy family farm and moves her kids to Florida. So now he moves Alice into the farmhouse. If we're keeping track, I think he has 8 kids with 4 women. Okay. I think that's right.
Okay.
And Ken is just tearing up the place. I don't really understand how this works legally, but there are multiple quotes from state patrolmen and city cops and stuff about them pulling Ken McElroy over and him putting a shotgun in their face and saying, get away from my car. And then the cop themselves saying, okay, buddy, I'll get you next time. Like the cops were legitimately afraid of him.
Wow. They were just getting punked by him.
Yeah. And I think it might have something to do with them being understaffed, or like they would only go out one, like single in a car, and they didn't have backup, and they're on these rural roads. They would pull him over for stuff like taillight out, right? Or maybe suspected of stealing, and he would just point the gun at them and say, "Get away from my car."
And they'd be like, "Damn it! All right, well, shit. Maybe next time he won't have a gun on him."
Right, and I think it's odd. I can't explain that piece of it, and I don't understand how it's legal. But people would just say, "Okay." Sounds good. I think there was like one cop in the history of the whole county, like one state patrolman who had a reputation for standing up to him because he was better at getting to his gun first, I think is the idea.
Okay.
But people were terrified of him.
Yeah. I mean, I'm terrified of him and he's dead. And I'm just hearing about him in the apartment of my house from my wife.
Yeah, he's a pretty scary dude.
This guy is really scary.
So in 1969, Ken moves Alice and Juarez to the family farm. And, you know, obviously he's still terribly abusing Alice. He also had tons of girlfriends, like throughout this whole thing. I think that's not, you know, obviously it's like he's constantly.
That's just his thing.
Yeah. And they participate in these crime rings, you know.
Oh, they do?
Yeah. So women that he's dating are also people who work for different farms and like know different farmers and scout things and tell them when people are out of town. So they're all kind of working together.
Yeah.
Around 1969, he'd racked up 19 felony charges between violent offenses and stealing, and he beat all the charges. He was never convicted of any of them.
Wow.
Yeah, because people just wouldn't testify against him.
Yeah.
And they didn't have the evidence.
So he's just the most emboldened kingpin of his situation.
Right. Everything feeds into the idea that he can't be stopped or regulated. And I think a lot of that was luck, and a lot of that was just him being a predator, you know, and knowing how much he can get away with, how to align himself with people he can control. Right. So in 1970, Alice calls the cops and she's freaking out. She says Ken is chasing her and shooting a gun at her. So there's a new sheriff in Andrew County who takes the call, and he pulls Ken over and searches Ken's vehicle. And while this is happening, Alice kind of recants her statement, and she says she's going to not press charges. She refuses to press charges, and they have to let Ken go. She said, "Sorry, I made it up. I was just upset." Right. And after that, Andrew County farmers lost $100,000 worth of pigs that year in retaliation for this arrest. Like basically Ken hadn't been working in that county at all.
Yeah.
And then after they arrested him, they didn't even arrest him. They detained him and searched his vehicle.
And for payback, he was like, "Now I'm stealing all of your pigs."
And a huge part of his MO is just straight up retribution.
Yeah.
You know, that's a big part of it.
He's like a vengeful, spiteful bastard.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, that keeps people from doing anything with him.
Yeah.
They're just like, if I make the wrong move, he'll come back at me like Trump. What did he used to say? I'll hit him back 10 times harder.
Yeah, right. I wonder how this guy Ken would have done in a big city.
I mean, I think probably pretty well.
He's as ruthless as any big time crime figure from this era. It's just in this weird small town context, you know, like I wonder if he'd be like a good killer for the mob. You know what I mean?
I don't know if he got pushback from someone who is equally as powerful for him, if he would fold. And I think that the way that people talk about this story often is they just call him a town bully because people don't confront him.
Yeah.
He figured out a way to kind of not be confronted. And that's kind of what I thought of when I read about how people say they don't ever remember him getting into a fist fight.
Yeah.
You know, they don't remember him fighting.
They don't ever remember him proving himself as an actual tough guy.
I mean, he's coming after young girls.
Yeah.
He's got poor people who can't afford a lawyer.
Yeah, grandfathers.
He's got grandfathers. Yeah. Later in the story, he victimizes a 70-year-old couple.
Yeah.
Like, he does that. He's always armed.
Yeah.
And he finds a way to have the upper hand in a situation. But it's very rare that you will read a story about him that involves him coming up against someone who's equally matched with the same weapons and advantages.
Except for maybe the cops, I guess.
Kind of, you know, but it's like the cops he's always taking by surprise because they don't expect somebody to pull a gun on them. At least I've read maybe 4 or 5 interviews with different cops who dealt with him, and it's basically they pull him over and then they look into the window and then they're staring into the barrel of a shotgun. Yeah. So it's definitely at least the element of surprise. Yeah. You know?
Yeah. So, right. Probably he would have like stepped to any sort of big city crime people and just whimpered away.
I mean, who knows, right? Yeah, but I think the idea is that he is a bully. Yeah. And he tends to target people who are drastically undermatched for him. Yeah. You know. And just to throw this out there, after he stole that $100,000 worth of pigs from Andrew County. Yeah. Okay, so that was happening. And a little later that year, Alice was working with one of his girlfriends, this girl Marty, and they get caught by the police. So the women bust on Ken, and they're working in Andrew County. They bust on Ken. They tell Andrew County everything that Ken's been doing. You know, they can corroborate all of these different ways in which they helped him steal these pigs. So they've got all this evidence. And the police spent an entire year putting together a case to charge Ken for all of this hog theft. And right at the end, like a few days before the trial, Marty and Alice both recanted their statements and Ken got off scot-free. Oh my God. Like it just keeps happening like that. Like towards the end, right before the trial, after everybody arranges the whole thing.
Yeah, so frustrating.
In 1972, Alice takes Juarez and she leaves Ken. So Ken finds her at her mother's house and he tells her, I'm coming to take my son no matter what. So Alice is wanting to leave. She goes, she buys a pistol and she's planning to shoot Ken if he shows up to the door. And as she's loading the pistol and trying to figure out how it works, she shoots herself in the hip and she has to go to the hospital.
Oh, damn.
So now Juarez is with her mom, I believe, and they're like safe. They're somewhere else. And her stepfather, Otha, is the only person now in her family's house. So Otha's alone. He's waiting for Ken. And Ken drives up in this car. He finds out, you know, where the house is. He shows up at the car and it's dark outside. It's nighttime at this point. And they basically start playing this cat and mouse game where like he sees the car and Ken's not in it, right? So Otha's trying to figure out where Ken is. He's turning off the lights, turning on the lights. Anyway, they're trying to figure out where each other are in relation to each other.
It's like a shootout? Do they have like guns?
They have guns. They're not shooting. And in the midst of this, Ken pops out and he shoots Otha in the leg.
Everyone's getting shot in the leg over here.
Everybody got shot in the leg. So that happens and Otha's like, I'm filing an assault charge against Ken. And after that, everything goes to shit. McElroy starts doing this thing that he'll do for the rest of his life where he stalks Otha and Alice's mother. So he calls the house almost every day. He challenges Otha to come outside and fight. He, you know, stalks their house around. He shows up in his truck holding a rifle outside of the window, just menacing them, revving his engine. He does this for 10 months and the trial just keeps getting delayed. So the trial is just for the assault against Otha. He's like, no, I am testifying. I'm not giving up. This guy is going to pay for shooting me in the leg, right? So Ken's tried and true method of beating any sort of charge is to do anything he can to get the trial delayed.
Like what?
We'll kind of get into that. I mean, there's a million different ways, and I don't know that much about laws to be able to really tell you all of the reasons. I mean, like, we'll see in the future. Sometimes you can say this county's prejudicial, like I can't get a fair trial in this county, so I need a continuance on the trial to move it to a different county. You can say my counselor's not available at this time, so I have to move my date to a different time. There's just like all kinds of ways you can do that.
And then the idea is keep delaying so I can continue to threaten these people, and eventually they'll realize like this is not worth it and whatever.
Exactly.
All right.
So he's just bullying and stalking people for so long that they give up and they refuse to testify. So eventually, over 10 months later, Ken finds Otha in a bar in St. Joseph and he pulls a big hunting knife on him in front of everyone. And there are a bunch of people in this bar. And he says, if you don't decline to testify in the trial, I'll kill you. And he says it in front of everybody. And Otha just says, no, I'm standing my ground. I'm going to testify. So Ken leaves and he comes back with a gun and he's screaming at the owners to lock all the doors to the bar. So he's locking everybody in. He's got a gun and he's threatening Otha in the face with this thing. And he says, you know, like, you better recant, tell them you're not going to testify. And Otha just says, I just figured I was going to die. He's like, no, I'm not going to do it. So Ken blows a hole in the floor of the bar with a shotgun, blows a big hole in it. And then he leaves without killing Otha, right? Because he's a big, stupid ass bully.
Yeah, so he just threw a huge tantrum and didn't get what he wanted. And then he was like, well, then I hate your floor. And then left.
But the thing about it is, by the time the police got to the bar, nobody saw a thing. All of the witnesses said they don't know what happened. Nobody saw what happened. They didn't see the altercation because that theatrical sort of display scared the shit out of everyone in the bar. And that's part of what he does and like why he does what he does.
Yeah, that works for him. These are like country folk or whatever. That are like,
I mean, I think it would work for anybody.
Yeah, of course.
You know, I mean,
that's
they
right,
like
that's right.
he can figure out where you live.
Yeah.
You know, he knows where everyone lives. Everyone knows whose car is what car. Even in different counties, like people just know each other in these small towns.
Right.
So they're just not safe, especially if the cops aren't going to be like aggressively detaining him.
Yeah.
At this point, they know that he shot Otha in the leg.
Yeah.
He's out on bond and he's able to do anything he wants and have a gun. You know, they're just kind of like, well, obviously, if he's getting away with shooting this guy in the leg, I don't want him coming after me shooting me in the leg.
Yeah, right.
You know, it's like he got away with it, right?
Okay, so the cops show up. No one saw a thing.
Right. And Ken ends up, like I said, hiring this very expensive defense attorney from Kansas City. This guy's name is McFadden. And McFadden is the king of delaying trials, right? So he delays the trial. He's able to do all this stuff 2 years after
How do you live with yourself doing
McElroy shot Otha in the leg. There still hadn't been a trial and all the witnesses kept dropping out. And eventually Otha just told the county prosecutor to drop the case.
Yeah.
He's like, I can't stand this anymore. He's been stalking me for 2 years. You know?
Right.
I don't want to do it. And that's the story of how Ken got away with shooting Otha in the leg. It's insane.
It is insane.
You know, so while all this stuff is happening, before Otha dropped the charges, Alice had already moved back to the Elroy farm. And so she'd been living there, but eventually had to move out again so Ken could move in Trina Louise McLeod. So Ken started dating, and I put that in quotes, Trina in 1971 when she had just started 8th grade.
Yeah, that's definitely not dating. That's fully kidnapping.
Right?
Yeah, just straight up raping.
So he had different tactics. He would do stuff like Trina would have a date with a boy. And so Trina would tell him what boy she had a date with. And he'd grab the kid before the kid got to the house and say, bring her to me. And then the kid would bring Trina to him and he'd be with Trina and then bring her back. And then the boy would bring her back to the house. So his parents didn't know he was there. And he would also, her bus had 2 stops, meaning like a transfer point. So like when the bus picked her up from her house, it would drop her off in this little depot.
Yeah.
And then the second bus would take her somewhere else. So he'd pick her up at the depot. So she just stopped going to school.
Oh,
you know,
wow.
he would just.
Yeah. So he just straight up kidnapped her.
Yeah, basically. And in the fall of her freshman year, she became pregnant and she dropped out of school in 1972 when she was 14. And she got pregnant actually right around the time that Ken shot Alice's stepdad Otha in the leg. So that was already
all happening.
Yeah, all a brewing, right?
Great.
So in 1973, right after the birth of her first child at the age of 15, Trina tried to escape with Alice to Trina's aunt's house. So
the girls are pairing up and like, we got to go.
yeah, they've been living together and they were friends and like, you know, surviving together and stuff like that. So Trina's baby was actually in the hospital because she had just given birth and they decided they wanted to escape and they go to the aunt's house and it's kind of this long convoluted thing, but basically the aunts were like, you can stay with me as long as you don't leave the house because I don't want Ken finding out where you are. And they left the house to try to go to the hospital to visit Trina's baby. And then Ken figured out where they were. So Ken found them. And after this really crazy standoff, Ken gets Alice and Trina and the children Alice had brought with her to escape. He got all of them together, brings them back to the farm. He breaks Alice's nose and both of her cheekbones, and then he raped Trina. And then he took both the women back to Trina's parents' house. Trina's parents come out of the house. He shoots Trina's family's dog and then burns her parents' house to the ground.
Come again? What?
That is what he decided to do, to say, don't ever leave me. And her parents left. Her parents disappeared. They basically moved 20 minutes away. Trina's parents did. They moved 20 minutes away. And then a little while later, the aunt that the girls had been staying with went to go visit Trina's parents to see how they were doing. And she found a completely empty house. It was totally furnished.
Yeah.
There was clothes hanging on the clothesline, but her parents had just had ran away, essentially.
Wow.
They'd disappeared.
And just left their daughter behind and was like,
yeah,
she's with the killer now, and the killer has our daughter, and we're scared to our core.
Right. So now they're gone.
Oh, it's just so drastic.
So after all this happens, Trina has been sexually assaulted. Her parents' house is burned to the ground, so she needs to go see a doctor. And they ended up institutionalizing her for 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that was a tactic back then to help women with domestic abuse situations. So she didn't actually get any treatment, which she probably desperately needed.
Yeah.
But they just used it as a holding place. So
they're like,
safe.
She's insane, temporary insanity. So we're just going to put her in this, mental ward or whatever. And really they're just like, oh my God, we got to get her away from this guy.
Right. And they're trying to get her into a foster care situation. So they get Trina.
She's still a little tiny kid.
She's 15. Yeah. So she gets reunited with her baby, and then they take Trina and her baby and they put her into foster care. And McElroy is faced with 4 felonies, and the star witness Trina is being held in this secret foster home somewhere in Missouri. Mm-hmm. And with the help of this huge network of all these people who help him,
he finds her.
He finds where she's staying, and he starts threatening and stalking her foster family. So the foster mother, Ginger Clement, answers the phone. He's calling her relentlessly and saying things like, I know where your teenage daughters go to school. These are their names. Mm-hmm. He does all this research about her family. And he's telling her all these details on the phone. So Ginger Clement calls the police, and the police say he's technically not doing anything legal by threatening her children.
Really?
Yeah. And there's some funny stuff. Obviously this was 40 years ago, and I'm sure laws have changed since then. So I'm sure we're dealing with a different set of laws. But there's this funny thing of okay, it was a while back. It's in Missouri. I don't know about laws in Missouri. That seems crazy to me. Yeah. But then the other thing is a lot of these cops have dealt with McElroy for so long at this point that they believe that there's nothing they can do. They're like, we can't arrest him for doing this because he's just going to say he didn't do it. And he's probably going to scare you into not testifying that he did it. And so it's just going to stir it up. So these cops would kind of consistently say, he's just going to stir up trouble. If you do this, you're going to stir up trouble with him. And to protect you, just ignore him is what they were telling people to do, which I don't, what? I don't understand. But essentially, now McElroy is just sitting outside in his Cadillac, watching the house, calling every day. Technically enough of a distance away that he's not violating laws. He's still on public property. And he's really good at skirting laws in that way. Knowing that they can't get him for trespassing or anything.
Sure.
Really. He's really into committing crimes that are like a he said, she said situation.
Yeah. That's just the wimpiest thing. It's like, haha, can't get me. I'm on the other side of the block, technically 75 feet away.
Right. That, but the most horrific version of that. Yeah. And Trina's living with the foster family for months, and she starts meeting other teens, and she starts having friends, and she's 15. So she's, starting to have a life, with this kid. Time goes by. Eventually, Trina's case against McElroy goes to trial. The charges are being filed in Nottoway County, but the presiding judge, Montgomery Wilson, which remember this guy's name, he's widely known as being dumb. People talk about how if you're the last person to argue, you're usually the person who wins the case for him. Okay. And he's super publicly afraid of McElroy. He's scared of him. And so Montgomery Wilson recuses himself from the case. So it gets kicked to a judge in a different county. Before the trial, Trina, who'd been with this foster family for almost a year, was moved for her safety to her grandparents' house in Wichita, Kansas. So they're trying to keep her away from McElroy. And Trina gets out to Wichita, Kansas with her baby. She's super isolated. She's lost all her friends because she was living with like two teenage girls at the foster home.
Right.
She doesn't know anybody. And she's super, super lonely. She's still 15. And eventually she calls Ken to come pick her up.
Yeah.
So Ken comes and gets her from her grandparents' house. And Ken brings her back to Nottoway County and divorces Sharon. They're still married, technically. Sharon is, I think, living in Florida at this point. But he gets a divorce from Sharon. And he now is attempting to marry Trina. Because if they get married, then Trina doesn't have to testify against him. Right? Remember that from the last tactic.
Classic move.
Classic McElroy move.
That old McElroy maneuver.
So the problem is she's still only 15 and she can't, at this point, marry Ken in Missouri without her parents' permission, the parents that kind of disappeared.
Yeah.
And Ken can't fly to state for a wedding or anything because his head injury makes his nose bleed from when he got hit with the scaffolding, so he can't fly.
Oh, wow.
And the trial's in like 4 days or something like that. So Ken says, no problem. I've got this. So he disappears for a little bit and he comes back with Trina's mother to sign a consent form at his lawyer's office. And later that day, Ken marries Trina and she was able to refuse to testify against her new husband. So all the charges were dropped.
Is there a story about, did he force the mom to do it?
Nobody knows.
No one knows.
Yeah. She just showed up and did it. I mean, she's so scared of him that she moved away in the middle of the night.
Right. And he tracked her down.
Brought her in and then she signed the consent form and they were married.
You know, you'd think that someone would be like, all right, the primary witness here is a child. Maybe we can have a few experts come in and talk to the kid and get a statement together so that when the time comes to put her on the stand, she doesn't actually need to be there to do it. That there can be like some adults that protect her, that shield her from this, that say, okay, these are all the facts. There was a child involved. The person has a history of witness intimidation, blah, blah, blah. We're not hinging the whole thing on a child being brave enough to stand up to their abuser.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. We could probably talk about that for 1,000 years.
Yeah.
I had to reread the section so many times to figure out how it was even possible. You know, like I was like, I understand, I guess, legally how it happened, but it is pretty mind blowing.
Yeah, like morally and socially, how did it happen?
Yeah, right. Yeah. Exactly. So at the end of all of this, Trina's only condition for the marriage was to be the only woman living at the farmhouse. So Alice was like, peace. I'm very glad to get out of this situation. They split pretty amicably and Alice moved to a nearby town called Maryville, Missouri. And then 11 months later, around 1975, Alice gave birth to Ken Jr., the last of her 3 children with Ken. So there is some overlap there, but that is done with Alice's chapter. She got out. Said. So this last decade of stuff that Ken was up to, Ken McElroy was up to.
The shitstorm that was Ken McElroy.
Right. This is the bedrock for the town's case regarding their feeling that Ken is above the law, right? This has really cemented his reputation as somebody who just cannot get convicted. I mean, at this point, he's shot people. He's a rapist. He's a domestic abuser. He was also, you know, dealing with underage girls in a really public way. I mean, at one point, before Trina recanted or refused to testify, they had the motel owner who used to see him take Trina to the motel when she was in 8th grade.
Yeah.
You know, like they had witnesses that could testify to this horrible scope of what he did. And he got away with no consequences.
Yeah, this fool's out here shooting dogs just for the hell of it.
And burning down houses. I mean, the whole thing is so outrageous and it kind of just cemented this idea that he's Teflon.
Right.
Right. Which I think rightfully so. It's hard to believe that anyone could get away with all of that stuff. But
Yeah.
legally, he just made the right moves and he paid a ton of money. One of his cases was $30,000 in legal fees, according to him. So, I
Yeah.
mean, in terms of how much trouble he'd been getting into.
Yeah, he's like, how am I going to get this money? Well, I guess I'll go steal a bunch of pigs and they won't catch me doing that.
Right. Well, it's like an excuse for why he was living in this 2-bedroom farmhouse. Right?
Right.
And I also want to say that all in all, it seems like the people who lived in the towns were way, way more upset about the cattle rustling and the stealing than they ever were about Ken terrorizing the poorest, most vulnerable families and young girls in the county.
Yeah.
And I think that comes back to haunt them later.
Mm-hmm.
So I just want to say that.
Okay, good. I appreciate that.
All right. So Ken is amazing with hunting dogs. I didn't kind of mention this, but throughout his whole life, he's been this amazing trainer and people pay a lot of money for his dogs. That's the one thing that he does that actually does make money. It's like training and breeding hunting dogs.
Yeah.
He also had some dogs on his property that he would starve and feed speed to protect his house. And they were very violent dogs.
Yeah, I've heard. I haven't heard of feeding dogs speed. I used to hear of feeding dogs gunpowder.
What?
Yeah, in my neighborhood, it was like you can't go over there, like because there was in the early '90s there was some pretty intense dog situations in my neighborhood, and that was the rumor. Is like, oh yeah, they feed that pit bull like gunpowder, and they would be crazy violent.
I don't know.
So
I wonder
scary.
if that's like a true thing. I
I
feel
know.
like that sounds like a little kid in the neighborhood thing. Like, no, dude, he feeds them gunpowder. He feeds them firecrackers. But anyway, so he did do this thing that was supposed to bring in money.
Yeah.
But it would never have brought in enough money for him to do the things he would do, which is buy super expensive cars and have new guns and keep like 8 different women and like 30 different kids, right?
Yeah.
And his lifestyle and the way that he conducted himself just kind of added to this crazy legacy that he was building.
Yeah, he had a mystique.
Right.
He's a gun-wielding maniac with 95 child brides and a pack of dogs that will also hunt you down.
Right. It's just overwhelming to the average farmer in the area.
Yeah, it's
right?
overwhelming to me now.
Yeah, it's overwhelming to me too. But I bring that up to say that there were tons of stories circulating about him. And one time he got super drunk at a bar with his friend and they decided to go steal a bunch of cows. And the way they were going to do that is they were going to put all these cows in his horse trailer. They back it up to the farm. They get the cows in there. They take off and a deputy kind of sees what's going on and sees that they're stealing these cows. So the deputy starts chasing them. The cattle trailer or the horse trailer blocks the license plate of the truck. And his friend's in the side seat and he says, I don't know. What are we going to do, man? What are we going to do? And McElroy says, watch this. He drives over a bridge, blocks the bridge with the horse trailer full of the cows, unhitches it, and drives off. So the deputy couldn't really see the truck or the license plate.
Right.
Then he goes back home and he calls the police and he says, someone just stole my cows. They're in my horse trailer and it's on this bridge. And the police get the horse trailer full of cows and bring it to McElroy's farm.
And it worked?
Yeah. And then he got the cows.
Oh my God.
Like he just do stuff like that. It's like Beverly Hillbillies meets like, I don't know, The Exorcist. So in 1976, Ken McElroy finally graduates to terrorizing full-grown adult men. He goes to a farmer's house named Romaine Henry, and he's really jacked up, and Romaine Henry's trying to figure out why he's mad. It's kind of in the middle of the day. I think it's like 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And McElroy says, you were on my property driving your white Pontiac. Why are you driving around my property? And the farmer, Romaine, he says, spoiler alert, I don't own a white Pontiac and I don't know what you're talking about. So McElroy shoots him in the stomach.
Oh my God.
And this guy's like, I think he's in his 40s at the time. He like jumps in the truck. He tries to get back to his farm to escape McElroy.
Yeah.
And McElroy chases him with a gun hanging out of the window and is like chases him all the way back to the farm. And eventually he just kind of gives up and leaves. And Romaine Henry survives, but he is hospitalized for a week because he has to have surgeries to remove all of the buckshot out of his stomach. And he also shot him in the face partially, so he had like stitches on his face and on his forehead. So now you have Ken McElroy shooting a farmer in the middle of the daytime in like Skidmore proper on the roads, right?
Yeah, but he's gonna get off.
Right. Okay.
I mean,
so there's this thing. Charges have been filed.
Yeah.
Romaine Henry's mad.
Yeah.
Everybody wants justice.
Yeah, it doesn't happen.
Remember, old Nottoway County Judge Montgomery Wilson recuses himself again from this case because McElroy had threatened to burn down his barn earlier, and then coincidentally, the barn had burned down. So that judge is just like, I literally will not try any of his cases.
That is so intense.
So the trial is kind of a mess. The prosecutor is pretty positive that the jury was being tampered with, but basically it comes down to McElroy had two people bearing false witness who placed him at the McElroy farm that day and said there's no way he could have shot Romaine Henry, and Romaine Henry was probably mistaken. There was one guy, a farmer who had been out in the field, who'd seen McElroy shoot Romaine Henry. And that guy was like, well, you must have done something. And he didn't want to testify.
Yeah.
And so he went up to Romaine Henry and he says, I'll testify, but you have to tell me what you did to him. Because I'm sure he shot you for a reason. No man shoots another man for no reason.
Right.
And Romaine Henry's like, listen, dude, I didn't do anything.
I don't have a white Pontiac.
I wasn't at his house. I literally don't know what he's talking about. And that one witness was like, you're a liar. And so he refused to testify at the trial because he was like, there's no way he'd shoot you for no reason. So the jury voted unanimously for an acquittal and he got off scot-free. Just ended up being 3 people against 1.
They're like, someone else must have shot you in the stomach. Don't know what to say.
That was their defense.
Were there any other people arrested? Who else could it have been?
They're just like, you just must have been mistaken. I don't know you. You don't know me. You probably just thought I was somebody else. And then later that year, after the trial, McElroy came back to Romaine's farm and shot at him with a high-powered rifle. He also went around to the bars, like the D&G, and openly bragged about he thought he was going to kill him when he shot him, and he can't believe he survived.
I like that that's what he is bragging about. I can't believe he survived. How about I can't believe I got away with it? But I guess he can believe it.
Yeah.
I guess at this point, that's just his deepest belief.
Yeah, he just thinks that everything he does is going to be successful. So he's like, how was that not successful? I shot him and he didn't die. And this kind of takes us into his next phase of this terroristic behavior. So in 1977, Ken has kind of upped his game, and now he's making tens of thousands of dollars burning down buildings for insurance money. So he's making more money than he ever had.
Is he an arson for hire, or is he buying buildings, taking out insurance policies, and then burning them down?
The book that I read didn't say, and I was actually curious about that. I think that he was an arson for hire. Is my guess.
That makes more sense.
I don't think he's the type of person who's taking out insurance policies, but I honestly don't know.
Okay.
I don't know the answer to that. But he is making more money than he ever has. So he remodeled the old farmhouse and he took some
extra room.
He
finally.
did. He added some rooms and he like redid the whole thing. Trina had 3 kids at this point with him, and then he also took 3 of his kids he had with Sharon over from Florida and moved them in. So at this point, there's like 8 people in total living at the McElroy farm.
So his parents and everything are gone at this point.
They actually his dad died, but his mom was living in a little house down the road. So they had moved out. So it was just his farm.
And all 15 of his siblings are long gone at this point.
They were around. Like he's really close with some of his sisters. I think he wasn't close with all of his siblings, but his brother Tim like lived and took care of his mom. So they were around. But not super heavily featured in this story.
Okay.
Like he's kind of what is it called? Like a monster unto his own, He was just kind of doing his own thing.
Do they interview any of the siblings in the documentary?
No, but they did in the book.
Uh-huh.
Mostly like they didn't talk as much. Tim talks a little bit, about their childhood and stuff like that, but they talk a little bit more about a few of them being devastated when he was murdered.
Do they talk about cutting him some slack or feeling like he had a bum rap around town? Or is there any sort of like, I can't believe my brother is this crazy violent maniac?
I don't want to spend too much time on this because we probably will a little later.
Yeah.
Based on the documentary that was produced for Sundance, in those interviews, everyone thinks that he is a really good guy. I think that if you were close with McElroy and you weren't a wife, that he kind of took care of you.
Yeah.
You know, I think that that's how he became so successful is, you know, he's taking poor kids and girls that he's dating and he's giving them money and paying them for stuff like really generously. And then they're like, oh, don't worry, like Trina's in that house.
Yeah.
Like this is where the cop lives. You know, like these cows, this farmer's out of town. You can go get these cows tomorrow.
Yeah.
And he's maintaining that kind of loyalty with rewards.
Right.
You know, and I think that that's my impression with the kids and stuff like that.
Yeah.
People were very, very, very loyal to him.
Yeah.
And aside from the horrific way he treated the women in his life, even with his girl children, they all say he was like awesome.
Yeah.
I mean, almost to the point where it's like disturbing. Like this documentary is just about how the documentary is interesting. We'll kind of get into that later, but they really just talk a lot about how their family was really victimized and that their people didn't really know their dad, but their dad did terrible things and they just don't acknowledge it.
Yeah, I mean, he's obviously got some sort of charisma that puts him at the center of a lot of people's affection.
The people who were the subject of his affection feel like there's no way he could have been as bad as people said he was or something.
Yeah, I don't know. That seems like a kind of a classic MO for horribly violent psychos.
Right. Okay, so back to the story. We're at the end of the 70s. This is a kind of a piece of information, and this kind of shows you how integrated the town is and like how weird it is that he got away with all this stuff. The foster parents that took care of Trina when McElroy had first, you know, done all of these horrific things to her early in their relationship, they opened a bar called the Shady Lady in town.
Good name.
And Trina and Ken McElroy were regulars there. So Trina at this point was around 19 years old, and she would go to this bar that Ginger Clement owned, and they would just like sit at the bar and like not talk about it while she stood next to Ken McElroy, who like threatened her whole family and children and stalked her for like a year.
Right, because he had just burned down Trina's house.
Yeah.
And like her parents had to run away in fear.
Yeah, and then but that's who's hanging out at the bar together.
Right.
You know, and that's a good illustration of how they weren't isolated. They were all in the same pool together, and McElroy would go and be in the mix all the time. He never retreated. And, you know, Ken wasn't getting convicted of anything, but it did in some ways make things socially worse for him because people started talking more, right? It's just been so long. It's at this point been decades of him just terrorizing the town.
Yeah.
And he just, you know, shot Romaine in the stomach and got off. You know, it's just people are starting to talk a lot more.
Yeah.
And for him, that's just a huge trigger. So he started doing more petty crimes at this point. One of his favorite things to do was to pay poor kids really good money to steal the toolboxes of farmers who lived around him. And then he would just like keep them or burn them.
Oh, just to mess with people.
Yeah, because
just to
people
be a
really needed the
dick.
tools.
Yeah.
And he doesn't care.
Yeah.
You know, so he was definitely feeling nitpicked by the town, and so he would just retaliate in these small ways.
He's a sadist.
Sadist.
Whatever. Because it's sadistic.
Yeah.
He's a sadistic.
In 1980, David Dunbar won the election of town marshal in Skidmore on a bet. There was a mayor who said, I bet you that you can win town marshal.
Yeah.
And he goes, I bet you a case of beer. And he's like, I don't know anything about law enforcement. I don't know how to shoot a gun. That's ridiculous. No one's going to vote for me. and he won by 4 votes.
Now that would make a good movie right there.
Yeah, so he has no training.
Yeah.
They wouldn't buy him a gun, so he had to buy his own gun.
Oh, no, it's like school teachers nowadays. They're
Yeah,
like, you need some pencils and some rulers? Gotta go get them yourself, lady.
Oh, man, it's not even funny. And this guy was at this point in 1980 at the peak of McElroy's
Craziness.
prowess.
Yeah.
He's the only local law enforcement in Skidmore, which is just like, oh no. So that's our new marshal.
Yeah.
And in April of 1980, a teen and a little child came into the B&B grocery on Main Street in Skidmore, which was owned by Lois and Bo Bowenkamp. And they're an older couple in their late 60s. I believe they were 68 or 69. And the youngest, a little 4-year-old girl, grabbed some candy off the shelf, maybe like a dime's worth of candy. And the clerk asked the older girl to pay for the candy that the little girl took. And the older girl refused and snatched the candy away from the younger girl and threw it back on the candy shelf. So the little girl starts crying. Mm-hmm. And that's how they exit the store.
I always get nervous when you kind of slow down and you start giving like the detailed account of something that seems like an aside, you know?
Well,
okay,
we're ramping up to the turning point in our story.
Okay, so they leave the store crying.
Little girl leaves the store crying. And a few minutes later, those girls, their older sister shows up.
Uh-huh.
And she is furious, right? How dare you accuse a 4-year-old girl of stealing? Mm-hmm. How dare you make my sister cry?
Okay.
And the clerk in the store is saying, I didn't.
Yeah.
The girl she was with was the one who snatched the candy out of her hand. Yeah. I just asked them to pay and she got upset. She snatched the candy.
Yeah.
So the older sister says, this is ridiculous. My family will never do business with you again. And at this point, Lois Bowenkamp is out there with her clerk and she's like, fine, I don't want you to come in anyway. Just leave. So this girl, super upset, she leaves. So Lois Bowenkamp kind of calms down. Her clerk calms down. Her clerk says, those girls were the McElroy girls. And Lois is like, I don't know who that is and I don't care. And her clerk is like, probably you should care a little
and
bit.
don't act like you don't know who Ken McElroy is.
Well, she's actually not originally from the town. Mm-hmm. So some people know of him, but have never even met him.
But she's about to meet him.
Well, she's about to meet him.
Okay.
So the door opens and in walks Ken McElroy. He is at this time 46 years old. He's 5'10". He's about 230 pounds. Constantly, every account that I read says his legs are like tree trunks and his arms are like the size of men's legs. So he's supposed to be like kind of a jacked dude.
Yeah.
Huge chest, big beer belly. And he's got his jet black dyed hair. It's slicked back with all this oil and these massive sideburns. He also has what people call like a heavy brow. So he's got this, low slung, low eyebrows, and you can't see the tops of his eyes. You can only see these little white circles under his eyes, like he looks like a cartoon, like evil vulture.
Well, Muriel is making that face to me, my dear podcast listeners, and let me tell you, it is upsetting. So
don't you say that about me. And he's got tons of tattoos. He has Mom on one side and then he has Ken on the other. So he got his own name tattooed on his fingers, which I don't get that.
Okay.
And he's dressed to the nines. Mm-hmm. And for him, that's really nice knit slacks and like Western shirt and cowboy boots.
Okay.
So he walks in and he always moves really slowly and deliberately, kind of like a cowboy. And he's holding this big ass knife. And Lois Bowenkamp says, you can put that knife away. And he goes, this is the kind of person he is. He says, well, can I clean my fingernails? And then he just sits there and stares at them while he cleans his fingernails with this giant knife.
Yeah.
And Trina then busts into the shop. She's screaming. She's saying, which one of you bitches told my children they were stealing?
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to beat your ass. And she's like a banshee, right?
Yeah.
So it's this really bad scene. Mm-hmm. And the woman who knows McElroy says, let me tell you what happened. And the two women kind of calm down and they say exactly what happened, right? The little girl picked up the candy. The middle daughter, whose name was Debbie, didn't want to pay for it. So she kind of took the candy away and the girl got upset. And, McElroy and Trina are saying, why would Debbie lie to us? They said you made her cry, da, 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 da. And the ladies are really calm and they say, I don't know why she lied to you, but I'm not lying. This is what happened. And there's kind of a calmness that comes over, and Ken McElroy relaxes a little bit. The night goes away. Trina's kind of quiet, right? And Ken McElroy says, okay, I'll just take a pack of Pall Malls. Right? He says, I'll just take a pack of cigarettes. And Lois Bowenkamp, remembering what his older daughter Tammy had said, says, we don't do business with your family anymore. And Ken looks Lois in her face and says, fair enough, and turns around and leaves with Trina. And this kicks off the most horrific year in the Bowenkamp's life. And within a year, Ken McElroy will be dead.
And that's where we need to pick up next week, is it, Muriel? Leaving us with the cliffhanger. Oh, my God. Well, I don't know why, but that really made me want to clean my nails. Give me a big old knife and I'll clean my nails. I don't know why. Oh, I feel dirty, I guess. Okay, Muriel. Well, thanks for that. I guess we have more Ken to look forward to next week.
Yeah.
Would you like to give credit where credit is due and shout out your resources real quick?
Yes, I would. For this episode and the next episode, I read the book In Broad Daylight, A Murder in Skidmore, Missouri by Harry N. McLean.
Nice.
I also watched this kind of interesting documentary that's only on the Sundance channel, so it's a little hard to get unless you have a subscription. But it's called No One Saw a Thing, and it's an episodic 6-part series, and it's pretty good. Lots of interviews.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, great. Now I have to go relive this when I edit this stupid episode. So.
I've been having nightmares about it.
Oh my God. How could you not?
Well, there's a lot more that happens that's way, way, way violent.
Yippee! Thank you so much for listening to Muriel's Murders. Muriel did all of the research and I did all of the sound engineering and post-production.
To help support the podcast and to unlock exclusive episodes, please sign up for our Patreon at www.patreon.com/Muriel's Murders.
And find us on social media. We draw and animate little bonus content cartoons for Muriel's Murders. You can find us on Twitter, TikTok, YouTube, Instagram. And we've been getting some love, so we want to give a couple of shout outs. We want to shout out Colonel Timmy, The Deli Girl 83, T Fizzle, Brody Ducharme 0, Little White Poppy, Beekeeper 2021, Mari.Notary, Mary Springer, Alec 206, Chofnas, aka Nina, Midwest Girls, Brokomi Kwan, Meg Mafar, and Becky Pool 26. All of you guys have reached out, said nice things, showed your support. Every follow we get, every like we get is huge for us. We're a new podcast and that kind of stuff is crazy helpful. So thank you to everyone who's shown us some love. Our DMs are open and we read them and we love it. And you can email us at murielsmurders@gmail.com.
Please rate and review Muriel's Murders on Apple Podcast, because guess what? It really does help us grow. If you're enjoying this and you want this thing to just take off like a rocket, give us a good review, man.
Our music is by Mario Castellini. Find him on Instagram at Castellini Beats.
Thank you to Ryan and Ryan at Campfire Media.
And if you want more Nick and Muriel in your life, check out our non-murder podcast. It's called Hell in Your 30s. Our most recent episode is about us doing our first 5K. It's a true couch to 5K glory story.
Yep, and we are still sore 5 days later.
Okay. All right. We love you guys, and we'll see you next week.